Hello and welcome to Eclectic Spacewalk Conversations. I'm your host, Nicholas McKay. Today we are joined by Claire Webb. Claire is a historian and anthropologist of science. Her research considers future-facing technoscientific objects since the post-war era in the United States. She is currently a fellow at the Berggruen Institute and the University of Southern California. Welcome to Conversations, Claire.
Thanks for having me.
It was a little bit of a mouthful, future-facing technoscientific objects. But first, let's get into, first off, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So lots of beer, lots of brats.
So Kugels is your favorite?
That's right. I worked for a beer company called Sprecher Beer. That was like my summer job.
Okay.
Pouring beer at the state fair.
Oh, okay. Wisconsin State Fair?
So fun. It's in Milwaukee, best fattest hog, everything fried on a stick.
Right.
Super fun.
Oh,
yeah.
That's great. That's great. So Midwest upbringing, so that must have been interesting. Now you're here in California. You went to school in MIT, so you've been all over, but your first kind of growings up were in the Midwest.
Yeah, actually my sister, who's moving out to LA right now, she's been sending me all these photos of Lake Michigan. We had a really idyllic pastoral upbringing.
Oh, pastoral, okay.
Yeah, and I'm very proud to be from Wisconsin. I'm a huge Packers fan.
Okay.
Yeah, hopefully Aaron Rodgers won't be leaving anytime soon. But
little pop culture sports trivia there, put in there. That's interesting, yeah, because Wisconsin, I went to school in Illinois and then lived in Chicago for a couple years, and so Wisconsin's very close and very interesting. But love that you, Kugels, summer shandy would be great right now.
I have to say, I don't drink them anymore.
Oh, no. Just like I've moved on.
Yeah. More of a G&T kind of now, yeah.
As it were. Okay. So getting back into just getting to know you, what did you want to be when you grew up first? What was your first initial?
I'm sorry to say my dream remains the same, and it's also what you might expect. Okay. I'd love to be an astronaut.
Yes, fellow astronaut, okay.
Yeah, I had a telescope when I was a kid and was always very interested in the cosmos. And I think my parents, who were both designers and artists, they showed me and my sister the Charles and Ray Eames short film, The Power of 10.
Oh, okay. I'm not familiar. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
So it's, I'm sure you've seen versions of it,
because
it's been iterated on
I see.
many times. And in fact, the Cosmos television series does kind of a remake of it, if you will. But the original film is you start actually in Chicago by Lake Michigan, a couple suntanning, having a picnic, and you zoom out. You're 1 meter away, and then 10 meters away, and then 100 meters away.
I see.
So the powers of 10. So you go out, all the way to kind of the superstructures of the galaxies, right? The clots of matter in the universe, and then you zoom all the way back into, I think, quarks. That they did. Yeah. So it stuck with me. It was so resonant for so many, I think, children interested in science. Just how large and how small our universe is, and how we perceive just a tiny fraction of it all the time. But through kind of scientific means, through astrophysical inquiry, we can learn more about our world, both very big and very small.
Right, and I think there was some stat. It was between the smallest and the largest structures of the universe. So say quarks, I think it's something a scale bars of 16 sextillion or something like that. Some absurd thing, or just too many zeros, But that's interesting. Yes, the powers of 10. I have seen some iterations.
Some
of those
version
things.
of
Yes. Okay, well that goes into. Well, was it your parents who were, the people or the influences that stroked your creativity the most, when you were younger, or curiosity maybe is a better word than creativity?
I think so. I think my parents had they really allowed us to take risks. So we were always, maybe my sister more than me, getting hurt a lot. We were both gymnasts, and so I think kind of developed a sense of bravery. Yeah, but they both worked in the arts, and my sister is now an artist and a sculptor too. And I'm really interested in in words, I think. But when I was in college and high school, I was kind of more science-oriented.
Gotcha.
And I think I was really inspired by this woman, Maria Mitchell. She was the first professor of Vassar College, man or woman, which is where I did my undergraduate in upstate New York. And I think I did some kind of school research project on her. Like in elementary school, I think I wrote maybe like an acrostic poem with her name.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so she discovered a comet. Her father was really kind of encouraging of women in science in the mid-1800s, which was a time that that pathway wasn't available to women, and so she was an inspiration for me. Marie Curie, Marie Curie. Okay. Yeah, kind of this dedication to science. And learning about, there's a wonderful history of women, not just in science, but in astronomy in particular.
For sure.
So, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, women were expected to do kind of micro tasks, like really kind of labor intensive, but very kind of contained, like needlework, for instance. And this is not my idea, but historians have often pointed out how astronomy, which is, long stretches of time where nothing really happens, you're in the observatory, and also just kind of looking at the plates, right, because it used to be these photographic plates that were...
Right. The actual technology of it. Yes.
It was really detail-oriented. So you would look and see kind of how one plate differed from another plate, and it was really labor-intensive, required attention to detail, was this kind of still process. And so astronomy actually ended up attracting a lot of women who often worked for... kind of male professors. There's a history of that at Harvard, for instance. But astronomy was this pathway that Maria Mitchell kind of forged and took young women into the fold to be astronomers. And so when I went to Vassar, that history was really evident everywhere and really was very inspirational. One of my first weeks of college, the department had arranged lunch with an alumna named Vera Rubin, who sadly recently passed away.
I was just about to ask you, literally my next question was, how do you think about the Hidden Figures representations, even though a little bit late, obviously, but nowadays, at least Vera Rubin is, it's talked about in parlance in the zeitgeist,
Oh, well, I'm
at least in my circles, it seems like from 10 years ago that you wouldn't even know her name, and then now it's like, oh, Vera Rubin. And
so Vera Rubin was, she was I think her husband was an astronomer as well, but she talks about going to observatories and there was only like a men's restroom, so she would have to sneak in, with young kids in tow. So had to be a mother and do her work at the same time. But anyway, so she came to lunch, and she is famous for first kind of putting together that there is something in the universe that we now call dark matter. So if you think about the Milky Way galaxy, and it's a disk with spiral arms, and it orbits around its center of mass, there's a reason for that shape, and there's a reason for kind of all of the gravitational movement. I don't know, gravitational dynamics. And what Vera Rubin discovered is that the rotation curve of the galaxy had to be consistent with some other force that acted on it gravitationally that was not explicable by what astronomers now call baryonic matter, which is like the matter that we see all around us. So like our clothes, the camera, the soil, the stars. There was something else, another force acting on it, which we now call dark matter. There's this maybe even more mysterious force called dark energy that people even know less about. But the baryonic matter of our universe only constitutes 4%. of the matter and energy in the universe, which is just, really...
Yeah, 4% is very, for everything that's out there, everything, and then it's only 4%. Well, what's that other 96%?
Yep, and people, I don't know. Yeah.
It's a good question. Yeah.
It's a great question. Mm-hmm.
So Vera Rubin, though, and other kind of women figures, is there anyone kind of today that you're more looking up to? I mean, I'm assuming in yourself you're trying to become that for yourself, but is there anyone that really kind of just you, not look up to, I don't want to say that, but is there someone else that you kind of constantly go back to their research or something that kind of you look up to now?
Sure. I think I'd probably have to say Dr. Jill Tarter, who is a founding member of the SETI Institute and has been doing the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, SETI is the initials, for her entire career, and just her intense focus, her unwillingness to kind of bend toward other people's expectations of her vision, her doggedness toward a task that, in which there's no guarantee of kind of the detection of the objects, aliens,
but you're still
that
going
she's seeking.
Full on.
Yeah, and she's, I met her when I was an intern at the SETI Institute, so I had like a summer research position there and got to know her a little bit. But since then, she's become a mentor and now kind of a colleague, and she's very inspirational in the sense that she, went to Cornell and was the only, woman in was the only woman in many of her science classes, and pursued this path, often facing derision, and forged ahead. And something too that I find so inspiring about Jill is that she really kind of marries this scientific focus and rigor with a hopefulness, and I would venture so far to categorize it as kind of as an ethical standpoint in the world, which is that doing science, searching for others, ultimately means cultivating empathy for our fellow humans.
Sure.
And I really admire that.
That's great. And then, just so we're clear, Jill Tarter is also, she was the famous scientist that was played by Jodie Foster in Contact as well.
Yeah, Carl Sagan kind of disputes that fact, but it's hard to not see those connections. Yeah, so Jodie Foster's character in Contact, I think, and many others think, is based on Jill. And a lot of the personality traits that Jodie Foster displays, I would say, are accurate.
Yeah, okay.
In Jill. Yeah, just like kind of focus, intense focus, intense drive. Yeah.
And then also that must have been very interesting that she went to Cornell. Was she under Carl Sagan at that time? Because he was at Cornell during that time as well, Andrew and stuff.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. I should probably know, but I don't know. Yeah.
Well, so not to get too far off, because we'll just do a little quick detour. What did you think about because it was in Contact, but the Arecibo telescope, radio telescope, being defunct? Great, destination for, I think it was GoldenEye 2007. There was a movie there, Contact as well. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but radio telescopes in general, that was the largest one and the longest running one, and then now it's defunct and not even working.
Yeah, it's sad, right? It's too bad. I never got to go. Yeah, and it is sad. I think what is hopeful, though, is that there's lots of other kinds of telescopes that astronomers use. So Arecibo is one kind of telescope that you can use for SETI research. So it doesn't move.
Right, it's in the ground, basically.
It's in the ground.
Yeah, it's basically a big hole cut in the ground, right? Yeah.
So, and it's an enormous dish, right?
Right.
There are other kinds of steerable telescopes that are... I was just looking at that because it
like
looks
arrays,
like
right? Like kind of satellite dishes or something.
Yeah. So one dish or one telescope that SETI researchers often use. It's the Parkes telescope in Australia. It's or the Green Bank telescope, which is in West Virginia, and they're enormous dishes, but you can actually control them. So you can have targeted searches in the sky.
Oh, wow.
You can point it to different places instead of it just kind of doing like a just kind of the what you're looking at being kind of informed by the Earth's rotation. Yeah, and then there are, of course, other kinds of radio telescopes, like an array of telescopes that if you like putting together kind of pieces
Very
of a puzzle.
small ones, right?
Smaller
and all,
ones.
Like, go to one. Yes.
Yeah.
And what about the James Webb Space Telescope? That's coming out this year.
I'm so excited.
I've been hoping for that for years, and then I'm assuming scientists and other people like are just, pretty hype, I would assume.
I'm super hyped. Yeah, so the James Webb Telescope is going to carry, in part, one of its jobs is to carry on the work that, telescopes like Kepler and TESS are doing, which is kind of categorizing the kinds of exoplanets that could possibly harbor life. Right. So, yeah, it's really exciting, and I'm very hopeful that we find life sooner rather than later.
That's interesting, and we'll get into that, basically, whether or not we maybe find life, around us, like at Mars and the pores and things like that, or some type of biosignatures through telescopes and such. But just to kind of catch people up, you're currently a fellow at the Berggruen Institute and USC, but let's catch everyone up on your academic journey. So, like, you went to Vassar College, and then so what did you study, and then basically bring us up until now, I guess the Cliff Notes.
Yeah, I took, so I was an astronomy major, and I had two wonderful mentors there, Debbie Elmgreen and Fred Cromie, and so I was, interested in kind of galaxies and like the large scale kind of structure of the universe, and we also, there's a great telescope there too, so like my campus job was working at the telescope.
Oh,
so
very cool.
Yeah,
very
so we had
cool.
like Girl Scouts come in, and we'd look at like the moons of Jupiter, we'd look at Saturn's rings, and we would also peer, I guess, back into the really early universe. So you and your listeners might know that light travels at a constant speed. It's the fastest thing in the universe that we know about, but it's not instantaneous. And so the light traveling from the sun takes about 8 minutes. So the photons that that we're now experiencing began their journey 8 minutes ago.
Right.
So looking back into the past requires us to look at things that are farther away.
Sure.
So the telescope at Vassar that I worked at, one of the research projects we did was looking at these astrophysical objects called quasars, which are these artifacts of the early universe. So the Milky Way, we now know, has a supermassive black hole at its center. And the earlier universe was even hotter, it was even more energetic, and what would happen in kind of in older galaxies is that a lot of times you'd have these particles streaming out, like really energetic particles streaming out, and a quasar is this type of early galaxy that has these kind of jets of particles, and if that galaxy happens to be oriented so that one of the jets is in the path of Earth, like a direct, it's called a blazar, which is it's a really funny.
Amazing.
Yeah, like great.
Yeah. Someone in the 60s or 70s made that name up. Yeah.
That's
fantastic.
for sure. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, and you can look at these kinds of objects through, not a super sophisticated telescope. You can still kind of perceive the light. So these objects are, the light coming from those objects is maybe like 10 billion years old. So you're really looking into almost,
very old.
Not almost the beginning of the universe, but much farther back.
Right, and you can't get to, 400,000 years after the Big Bang. That's like the Great Wall or something, because it was so energetic and so bright that telescopes can't see beyond that, right? Like, that's the idea, basically.
Right, and we should check with a particle physicist, because the details are kind of escaping me right now, but there are lots of different particles that existed in a hotter universe that no longer exist now. So photons appeared later. So what we think of as light happened happened later.
Later.
Yeah,
Later.
at some point. Yeah, and that's what places like CERN, which is the particle accelerator in Geneva, I spent a summer there working with scientists, with particle physicists, really, who try to recreate the conditions of the early universe by whipping around particles at near the speed of light. So, you have how it works most of the time is you have these jets of particles, and then they're controlled by magnets, and they're they're much closer together than these are. And once you get it up to speed, you put the two lines of particles in collision with each other. Those create particles that existed that are either hard to know where they are now or impossible to perceive now. So you create the conditions of an early universe to kind of see what kinds of particles existed back then.
And then that's how we kind of got the observations of the Higgs boson.
That's right.
And how that all kind of transformed physics in a sense, that we had found the God particle, et cetera, that gives mass to
that's right.
to atoms, et cetera.
I know, and I have to interrupt and say that the God particle, all the physicists I talked to there were just, it's not the God particle, like stop calling it that.
Well, I guess we can easily talk about science communication, because that's one of the things, that I like. Scientists I can guarantee, and from your testimony, is not saying that it's the God particle, but I guarantee you some editor or press person got on that and immediately kind of understood what that meant, and then it's kind of a very catch-all kind of thing. So I guess because you were talking earlier about you took even a class to then as you're going through research to be able to disseminate kind of the information and stuff, and what would you think that nowadays is maybe the biggest thing that science communication needs to work on, or I mean, it doesn't have to be a big question, but or is there good things right now? Because it seems like with smartphones and TikTok and all these other things, there are ways to storytell and get facts and information out there, but then there's also nefarious things afoot, etc. So do you have any thoughts on science communication in general?
Science communication in general. I think that I get frustrated that kind of a post-truth world that we saw with the rise of, I mean, not even the rise of Trump, but kind of misinformation has always percolated. It has never been so kind of amplified.
Weaponized.
Weaponized,
yeah.
I mean, you use the word nefarious, which I think is exactly correct. But in my view, and I think in maybe historians' view and journalists' view, we live in kind of a social milieu in which facts and truth are viewed with more and more derision. And I think that why people become scientists, why we become writers, is to inquire about the world.
Yeah, sure.
And so, yeah, I'm not really. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to put together words to answer your question. I think that there is this skepticism about skepticism. I would even say so. We should all be. Skepticism drives us to ask really interesting questions about the world,
yes.
And it leads us to write about the world in ways that are interesting and informative. And I think that kind of skepticism is now being collapsed with a mode of viewing the world that doesn't value truth, and I find that really terrifying. I'm not really sure it's a problem with science communication. I think it's a problem with the creation of a certain kind of that's driven by a really particular form of politics that doesn't value kind of facts and truth.
So it might be a level up. It might be a scale bar up above communication in general, rather than just science communication.
Yeah. I think so.
Yeah.
I think journalists are. My mom is a professor of journalism and communication. So, yeah, there are all these ways that journalists shape our world. There are many different ways to tell the truth, but I think that kind of in this we're not even post-Trump because he's still kind of
he's in the weeds.
Operating. Yeah, he's in the weeds, but he's created this appetite for use this word, the dissemination of kind of conspiracy that I find really frustrating. And as kind of you alluded to, that kind of attitude has bled into science, right? And we see that really, unfortunately, especially right now with kind of vaccine skepticism, for instance.
Sure. So let's get back to going back to you're looking for truth, as we were talking about. So you go to Vassar. We have a lot of observations, telescopes, etc. Teachings, and then you decide, like, why did you decide to pursue graduate studies? I know you said you mentioned an internship at CERN, internship at Ames Research. So, like, what was kind of your mindset and all of that?
Sure. When I was done with college, I didn't think that I wanted to go to graduate school for astronomy. So, I had some like restaurant jobs. I worked at like a few sushi restaurants, which was, I love sushi.
Well,
so that was
in a
nice.
Good place now.
Yeah,
you're
right.
Set now.
Right. I don't know. I moved to New York. My friends were there. There was kind of this exodus, or like, I wouldn't say exodus, a migration from Vassar to New York.
Sure.
And I worked at an architecture firm. I learned a lot about design, and I wanted to go back to school, and it took me 4 years to kind of figure out what that would be. Excuse me. Yeah, and I got really interested. I mean, I had always been interested in the search for life beyond Earth from an astronomy perspective, and I've always loved history. And so the project I went in with, which doesn't always happen, and you're going to go to grad school, so you'll figure this out too. That the project that you start with is not necessarily the project that you end up with. But in my case, I mean, it changed a little bit, of course, but I did really stick with it. So,
Did you know that's not normal? Because, like, I also wanted to ask you about that. How did you even decide on your topic, and stuff like that? Like, how did you, the process of, like, I just want to do a thing about search for extraterrestrial life. But, like, I just kind of want to see, like, progression, I guess you could say, because I think that for you, it seems like you knew what you wanted and you went and got it, but then, like you were saying, that may not be everyone else's like path.
Yeah, well, it's funny that you say that, because that it didn't feel like that at the time.
Okay,
right?
So it was all over the place. Everything was a journey.
I thought I wanted to be a writer. It's easy, like, in hindsight is 2020, to like look back and think that it was always going to work out in a particular way, but it could have been many other ways, right?
Sure.
I honestly, I don't really have a good answer to your question. I had this internship at the SETI Institute, and I worked with the astronomers there. And, the SETI Institute is not just devoted, like, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, which Jill Tarter wants to rename, right? The search for extraterrestrial technology, because basically what they are looking for is, within kind of this cosmic haystack, an indication of some kind of electromagnetic transmission of extraterrestrial origin that would indicate some kind of artificiality, right? That it wouldn't be created by what we know are kind of natural objects, that it would be created by, it would be a technological artifact. That's one part of what the SETI Institute does. They're broadly interested in the search for life beyond Earth, so microbes on Mars,
comets, I'm assuming asteroids. Things
like that. Right.
Yeah.
You're right. So maybe you're alluding to the idea of panspermia, that life was brought to our solar system by some kind of comet that had seeded life. Or they're also really interested in now at looking at exoplanets' atmospheres for evidence of lively processes. So the SETI Institute does a lot of, they don't just do kind of what we think of when we think of like Ellie Arroway, you know, in her
right.
car
Yes,
from context.
Yes. And just listening to like static and stuff.
Yeah, which is
not
like not at all what they do.
Not at all.
Yeah, but so I had that wonderful internship there and had been always kind of interested in the search for life beyond Earth, and it took me a while to figure out that I wanted to historicize that search and be a historian who wrote about the history of it rather than kind of being an astronomer myself.
Right. Okay. And then we're definitely going to get into the dissertation a little bit more in depth here in a couple minutes, but just wanted to kind of maybe a higher level view. So let's just talk about like what anthropology and history are as disciplines. Like what exactly are they? Because I know that like I'm going to graduate school for Science, Technology, and Society, STS, and then your graduate school program at MIT was History, Anthropology, Science, Technology, and Society. So like what exactly are history and anthropology in a sense, and then how specifically with STS does it kind of merge? Sure.
So I really think that what attracted me to it was that interdisciplinarity. My committee, I had an amazing committee, which is this group of scholars who guide you as you write your dissertation and do research and do coursework. So my advisor, Professor David Kaiser at MIT, who is somewhat annoyingly both a physicist and a historian of science.
Okay, wow. So he's got both sides. So he really is fun. Yeah, I got it.
So he was just an incredible advisor. So he and I worked together a lot on kind of the post-war science era, which is after World War II, institutions of science, and my focus is the U.S., so we'll stay local, kind of grew science educate. What did it mean to kind of be educated as a scientist? Dave is really interested in kind of the pedagogy of science. What does it mean to kind of teach things and discover them at the same time? So kind of what I mean by that is how does the process of doing science inform the detection of new objects. So that's kind of the social processes. So how as a group, as a social group, how do scientists make culture, right? What is important to them? What is their belief system? How do they communicate? How do they work together to define what science is, to peer into kind of corners of our universe, right? How do you go about discovering elementary particles? Like how do you go about creating the standard model of the universe? What are the social processes behind that, right? So social studies of science, or STS, originates from the perspective that science, like history, like sociology, like anthropology, is a mode of world making that is essentially social. So that's kind of the STS part. The history part, I was really interested in the space age. So what was going on in the late 1950s and the early all of the 1960s and the early 1970s, what was happening in the US that kind of drove this national interest in space sciences. So how were civilian scientists, biologists, geologists, and also kind of the more on the engineering side too, how was this group of scientists, engineers, how were they thinking about what it meant to leave the surface of the Earth, to explore the moon, to send probes to Mars, to send satellites to Venus, or spacecrafts to Venus, we have kind of we're the benefits of this scientific space culture. Right.
Because it's an edifice and a structure now. I mean, but that was still being built in the 60s, is what you're saying. It's like, it was almost like they're putting down the railroad track as the train is going. They're literally like putting it down. Yeah,
and in the late 1950s, there was this mandate to, beat the Soviets to the moon.
Oh, sure, with Sputnik and everything. Yes,
yeah, and
yes.
to send men into space, to send men to the moon. So, I mean, a lot of things were happening, right? There was this kind of ideologically driven set of priorities that was about kind of nationalistic interests. And then there was kind of a lot of basic science research going on. You know, how could people survive going to space? And something that I'm working on right now is a smaller project on the use of animals in outer space and the use of animals in high altitude balloons, in rockets, right?
Sure.
They had no idea what was going to happen
when you stuck them in there and just said, well, what's up?
Like, and they kind of did.
Yeah, like
you know?
Take vital signs and then we'll see what happens, right? Because I'm pretty sure even the first, like they sent, it was like, it was a progression. It was like a mouse and like a dog or something, then like a chimp or some type of primate, and then it was like it just kept going up and up. But animals have been used in scientific studies for a long time, and not just to space, obviously.
Right, and they're the two things that scientists were really kind of concerned with is the loss of gravity, and then the G forces both entering and exiting the atmosphere, right? Where does space begin? Like how much acceleration forces can you physiologically handle? And so a lot of the U.S. Scientists used chimps and other apes, and the Soviets used dogs because they were like easily trained. So concerned with gravity, what would happen to your cells in microgravity? What would happen to your lungs in microgravity? And then the other kind of area of concern was just cosmic radiation. So, there are these energetic particles that we're shielded from on Earth, but once you kind of get into the high atmosphere and once you get into space, they had no idea would mice come back with a ton of cancerous cells? Would it even be safe to send a man into space? And so animals were these precursors to kind of start to explore space. And now we, there was the all women spacewalk, and Elon Musk wants to go live on Mars, and that's kind of the legacy of scientists who were simply wondering if we could even go.
Right. Because the technical questions obviously will have technical answers about what speed it is you need to get out. But then what you're saying is kind of the historical and anthropological, society, social questions are much broader and much deeper and last much longer as well. I mean, we're sitting here talking decades and decades about, but we're still being influenced by that as well as what you're saying.
Right. And I think something that you do as a historian is you get to know these actors who are mostly dead, but just kind of to inhabit their minds when they were young, when they were at the beginnings of their or the height of their careers. How were they imagining outer space in the 1960s? Reading memos, what they wrote each other, quick handwritten notes that kind of reveal fears and hopes and dreams. That's what's really fun as a historian.
Yeah, and on the margins, really, and first person accounts rather than these because official published things, they're always going to get that, but I can imagine a handwritten note between two colleagues could be more important than a report or anything like that.
Yeah, what if we did it this way, right?
Yeah, and then, right. Oh, wow.
And then then you end up seeing, well, they did do it that way, and that's
Or what is it? I think it was the most famous of that is the wow signal or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
It was it was some type of signature that people didn't understand, and then the guy just circled it and was like, wow, and then that was a long decade or some type of long find to try and figure out what that signal was.
Yeah. It's and I can still, when you said that, right, I'm imagining the red, I think it's the red ink, and it's there's an exclamation mark in a big circle.
Extra. Yeah. over the top for scientists. Yeah. So cool. Well, let's talk about, I guess you could say, then history as a discipline, anthropology and science technology, because basically the narratives we tell ourselves about the past, present, and future, a lot of that is dictated on who was around, who had fun, like who the winners were, if you will, from history, etc. So I guess how can we as just people, when we look at history, how can we maybe not get hoodwinked and kind of go down and see, well, I'm going to put all my eggs in this narrative basket. How can people, kind of stay open, but then at the same time be curious?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to quote Jill again. I feel like we've been talking about her. Yeah, so SETI is a really interesting field because the scientists who search for technosignatures don't know if, how, when, where that object would appear. And Jill said something which I think is really astute, which is, we have these working methods, we use particular telescopes, we have certain data analysis processes.
There you go.
But she said something that's always stuck with me, which is that we reserve the right to get smarter. So
that's cool.
Yeah, it is cool, and I think about that not just about SETI, but if I make a mistake, then I'll do it differently the next time. What are ways? So your question really is, how can history teach us to move forward?
Yeah, like the different narratives, because basically one of the narratives that have come up is like World War II and the atomic bombing, and it's like narratives right now are vastly different than they were, say, when the atomic bombs happened, but that was still history. So it's very interesting for like the layman or a person that's just like here existing, well, what do you know what to believe? And I'm not saying to just journalists and things like that, but even thinking about history, thinking about what was possible and such, because even the people that were I'm assuming in the 50s and 60s, they're kind of, maybe not range or limit, but it was within itself. And then here in 2021, we have a different concept of that. We have a different kind of understanding of history. So I'm just trying to think about like what normal people or the layman can do and when history is happening. How can they kind of like, be mindful of the great things, but then also, be mindful of bull crap, you know what I mean, kind of.
Sure. So something I've written a little bit about, I'm not sure if this is like about what to believe in science, but something, maybe I'll try to answer your question in a different way, which is that in the 1950s and 60s, people were really preoccupied with the threat of nuclear war, right? That was, I think it's not going too far out on a limb to say that that was the defining fear of that generation, right? And so nuclear fear, we might say, was specific to kind of like a post-war world, the emergence of Cold War superpowers, that drove a lot of, and that drove the science that was going on. Now I think this era, and maybe you'll agree with me, could be defined by this fear of climate apocalypse, and maybe a more recent and acute fear is the kind of the collapse of global economies and global health systems when we're confronted by a pandemic, which we haven't seen the likes of in 100 years. So kind of to answer your question, and hopefully this is a hopeful answer, which is that these fears that we all share really make poignant, really illuminate that as humans we all need to kind of work together to overcome them. Maybe that sounds a little bit wishy-washy, but I think the point that I'm trying to get at is that every era is defined by hopes and fears, right?
Sure.
And we continue to move on. And the way to kind of work through them is to do it together. And so in that way, we look at kind of apocalypses of history, and maybe those apocalypses can inform how we deal with the next one.
Right.
Does that make
so,
sense?
Yeah, so it's almost like you're gaming it out, like going through a simulation in your head almost, and then hoping for the best. Okay, well, so that you just brought up kind of COVID, and I think this would be the best time to talk about it, but you wrote a brilliant NOEMA mag article that basically talks about, Earth's possible futures, and then you just kind of mentioned that kind of that hope. And so I'll just read basically one little paragraph, and then hopefully we can kind of riff on that.
Okay.
Thus, fears of terrestrial apocalypse animate pursuits of life and living beyond Earth. But conversely, imagining how life, including human life, might exist in an extraterrestrial context, and seeing the planet from outer space has driven imaginations of Earth's possible futures, both hopeful, course-correcting pathways, but also escapist fantasies of extraplanetary colonization. So it seems like it's not exactly a utopia dystopia thing, but it's very easily put up into that. In the course-correcting pathways, I see as almost like a regenerative Earth. Everyone's working for the regeneration of Earth, and Earth's happy and healthy and everything, and humans and animals and et cetera. But then also escapist fantasies of extraplanetary colonization. I mean, that's like the plot of every sci-fi movie. You know? So how do we kind of utilize something like COVID, something like that is history like that, as a way to shape our kind of future? Because as you were talking about before, you can almost simulate what, if we kept running this history forward, what would it mean? And then now we can kind of see in our COVID things of what would that mean in some types of areas of lockdown, or vaccine passports, or other types of things that come up with COVID, how we deal with work from home. So I just kind of wanted to kind of riff on that, and then it's coming from the possible future. So they're both hopeful in a sense, it just depends on which side you're on.
Thanks for... it's always funny to hear someone read back something you wrote,
because
it can either be good or bad. I was like, that sounds pretty good. The point of that article is, my goal for the article was to call attention to something that I've noticed both in my work in the archives and my anthropological field work with scientists who search for life beyond Earth, is that the objects that they seek don't yet exist, and it's unclear if, how, and will they ever might. So, right, I'm talking about microbes, on some exoplanet, or perhaps some kind of like oceanic creature like below, the ice sheets of
stuff. Ice sheets, okay.
Enceladus,
sure.
Something like that. We really don't know, but because we don't know, my understanding, or it's just something I've noticed in my research, is that the imagination of planets beyond, of worlds beyond, of beings beyond, of life forms that we can't even dream of, because they exist in an imaginary, they tend to kind of loop back. They create this kind of reflexivity to an invitation to understand how we operate on Earth. So, what I meant by kind of escapist fantasies of colonization is this impossible dream that going to Mars, we would leave behind, all of the social ills that we have here on Earth, right? I mean, there could be some kind of, extraplanetary pandemic, on Mars. And I get frustrated that those fantasies are often just kind of reinforce, or maybe not reinforce, they recapitulate a lot of oppressive social structures on Earth, like capitalism, ableism, and for instance, Elon Musk's, if you have seen his kind of fantasy about what the colony on Mars would look like, it's just a recreation of suburbia. Or
even worse, I mean, and that's the best kind of situation for me. And coming from my grandparents and coal miners, like that you're just talking about scripts, and like basically you're talking about the Pinkertons, and you're talking about like all that stuff in the back in the day where, Elon Musk has already said, out of his own words, that it would not be a democracy on Mars. You know what I mean? He's already said in his own words that it would be through debt servitude, that basically the admission tickets, to go would be so expensive that you're going to have to work. But then he said, well, there's going to be plenty of jobs on Mars. So again, it's like, it's very interesting to see that that's part of our future, if you will.
Right.
I'll say another thing out of the article. These threats have in different ways revealed how actions are never self-contained in global network systems. Each moment's particular planetary anxieties, pathogenic, climate, nuclear, have animated and informed scientists' pursuit of extraterrestrial life. So maybe that's a set for extraterrestrial life, but another thing that you said is basically through the coronavirus's march across the world and its disregard for political borders, the environmental movement is not really, gotten so... Well, the environmental movement highlighted the fragility of the planet's entangled life, and the Cold War ushered the concept of global nuclear disaster. So basically what you're saying is anticipations of worlds beyond Earth, places that might be or might be made to be habitable, are made possible by conceiving of Earth as both threatened and interconnected. Mm-hmm. So interconnected, I think we all know globalism, etc. But then now it's almost like this dystopic kind of over our heads, a threatened kind of thought process makes us think about aliens in a different way. Is that kind of how it plays out to a layman, I guess you could say?
Yeah, I think so. Right. So it's this exactly like you mentioned. So going back to kind of the Cold War example, in the archives, right, there was a group of civilian scientists who worked within NASA, which was a really political organization, sure. Right? But the group of civilian scientists were interested in finding life beyond Earth, and they were interested in working with Soviet scientists. They wanted to do everything that they could to find what I describe as a universal theory of biology. So if the Darwinian conception of life illuminates evolution, right? They hoped that finding life beyond Earth, hopefully on Mars, their best bet is that they would find it on Mars, would reveal life's origins. So
like a rubric of sorts, right?
Yeah. And if they found life on Mars, they imagined it would give them kind of a blueprint for the kinds of life, a universal theory of biology by which they could use as kind of a map to find life even beyond our solar system. Right. And they thought about this as a very as a really kind of hopeful endeavor. They wanted to sketch out a universal theory of biology, which still doesn't exist. And so they were really kind of concerned that this like Cold War posturing or nuclear disaster would prevent them from finding this like universal theory of biology, for instance. Then with climate change and kind of this environmental consciousness that I think originated in the 70s, let's say, which continues, which has only grown in concern since then, the interconnectedness of the Earth, what maybe we call the biosphere, what happens over here, affects the global climate, the planetary climate. That makes us realize that Earth is very precious and very fragile, and I think should serve as kind of an alarm to how we think about inhabiting other worlds, right? God, to go back to Elon Musk, right, wanting to like nuke the poles in order to like heat up the planet. NASA said that this won't work, but that kind of like brazen disregard for kind of the like a planetary climate on Mars is directly related to kind of like the ignoring kind of a planetary climate on Earth. And so in that way, Mars and Earth are in kind of like in conversation with, or our imaginations of like what we want to do here on Earth is like in direct conversation with like ways that we could inhabit Mars. Sure.
And then that's very interesting with how we see that, because even, I don't want to get too brazen in my thing about Elon Musk, but it seems like it's almost psychopathic thinking to then go to Mars without kind of, I don't want to say fixing Earth, but you know what I mean? Like we kind of need to make sure we're good until we go there, I guess you could say, or at least do the things that he's talking about, civilizations and all this other jazz.
And just to jump in, right? I'm often asked, like, would you go to space? Or there's this argument that you kind of alluded to, which is, why don't we kind of fix Earth before worrying about, spending billions of dollars going to Mars or even just outer space exploration, which
is definitely the end of the argument. I don't want to put myself on the end of that, but yes, like I'm with you on this.
Well, I actually don't buy it. I think that learning about our universe and exploring the cosmos and pursuing science beyond Earth has wonderful consequences for how we understand our own world, and kind of the deep thinking required to dismantle systems of oppression should be done in conjunction with, instead of.
Right.
Do you know?
Yeah,
do you know what I mean?
I kind of want to think about how it's almost like even in science fiction how we think about social systems. I mean, the Red Mars or the Mars trilogy, Kim Stanley Robinson, all those kind of things. It's like, well, there's a many different ways that we could skin this cat, But it's like, in what ways do we need to make sure that? Because like I agree with you in some sense, like space, the stars are where we need Ad Astra, everything like that, But then the frontiers mentality, I think as well. I think frontier is a very I guess a bridge word from the colonialization and stuff like that to then also unbridled curiosity, which I'm totally for. But like how it happens from theory to practice is kind of like where that
so
where the money's made.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you mentioned this. So something that I just found so fascinating is that scientists who search for life beyond Earth sometimes invoke colonial imagery or like colonial rhetoric, but in this kind of twist, they emplace themselves as like natives to Earth, and in a direct comparison to kind of like Cortez or Christopher Columbus, like coming to Earth, but in this case, like the aliens are the Columbuses, and we hope that they would be better than the original version. So this is all to say I think indigenous studies and kind of indigenous knowledge of the world, we need to be really kind of aware, and those perspectives are absolutely essential when we think about inhabiting other worlds. And I mean, to get back to your previous question, how do you not make mistakes of the past? Like being aware of a history of colonialism as we kind of work to go off Earth is absolutely essential in doing it with a sense of care and a sense of hope and a sense of inclusion.
Absolutely.
And directed by kind of like an environmental consciousness of preservation and care and respect.
Right, and that's a totally different kind of aspect than like, hey, let's just highest bidder, gets going on a rocket.
Yeah, yeah.
So we won't get too far, but this is great. So one thing, I guess we can transition into kind of your dissertation in a little bit, but let's kind of set the stage a little bit. We've talked a little bit about SETI and Breakthrough Listen, Jill Tarter. So SETI, search for extraterrestrial intelligence, but as you said, that they're kind of now focused for search for extraterrestrial technology, right? So more techno-signatures kind of things. Most of our listeners know about the overview effect, that was kind of basically my first essay. That's why I wanted to, start this whole shebang, was that kind of realization. And one of the things that I kind of was the biggest realization was not the things I said in my essay that we have a paper thin atmosphere, like it's hanging in a void. But one of the coolest things that I saw was the Earthrise photo was like the first time that the Earth had seen itself. Uh-huh. You know what I mean? And so not to get too grand philosophical, but I mean, the overview effect is basically the effect, the psychological effect that astronauts have when they see Earth from outer space. And there's only been, 500 or so in the history of human species, around 10 billion or so people. So not a lot of people have experienced this. But every single one, when they come back home, to Earth, they have this grand kind of way of thinking now. They have this grand way of going about the world, and they basically have an overview effect about seeing the world. And so just wanted to kind of see your effects on like our effects through the telescopes of looking out, and then now all of a sudden we have something that's looking back. How does that kind of change our historical kind of lens? You know, how does that change from us now looking out into the cosmos to then now us looking back through to us? But it's not, I don't want to say the cosmos looking back at us, because I guess it sounds too corny, but I guess any thoughts about the overview effect and riffing on that? You know?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, that image, I am really using this word deliberately, is iconic.
Okay, yeah, for sure.
That word.
Time magazine, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and there have been different versions of that image. So there's the Earthrise, which actually I'm not sure if you know, but the astronauts on Apollo 8, when they first saw Earth from afar, you know, it was the story that they tell is just amazing. It's like this performance and process of reorientation, right? Like that's the Gulf of Mexico, like that's Florida, where we just
like
launched.
Scales are totally different.
Totally different, and they're leaving the atmosphere, and they're going toward the moon. And that's Africa, and that's the Sahara, and you zoom out and you zoom out, and then I mean the Earthrise photo shows this desolate, barren, bleak, gray, the lunar surface, and then the Earth appearing to rise. So it completely inverts kind of our view from Earth, like looking out into the moon.
I didn't even see that juxtaposition, because that's very true. You know, you definitely see a little bit of the barren wasteland. Like there's nothing. All it is asteroidal impacts. You know
right.
what I mean? And
right.
then you have a ball, the marble of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So actually, it's not. I don't think that this is that known, but that image was actually rotated 90
right,
degrees.
I did know that. Yeah.
Yeah. But you're right. I mean, the effect is the same. And then there's the blue marble image, which was the whole Earth, right? And then there was the pale blue dot, which Voyager took, that Carl Sagan kind of facilitated, and it shows just a tiny, tiny Earth, like in the vast cosmos. So you get these kind of different landscapes, different kind of senses of scale, and they all, as you mentioned, evoke this sense of wonder, right. Feelings of preciousness for Earth. And one of the astronauts, I can't remember who it was, I mean, his sense was that it was both something weird happened, which is that seeing kind of Earth, or everything that he loved and cared for, kind of was not visible, right? You could see the mountains, like you could see the desert, you could see the ocean, you could see the clouds, but his wife and his family, everything that he cared about was on this kind of island in space as they were going farther and farther away from it. But the fact of not seeing it both endeared them even more to him, this center of liveliness in the universe. Just something else I think is really interesting too is that Heidegger, the philosopher, he had the opposite reaction to kind of the feeling that you're describing, which is that kind of the disappearance of technology, what humans make, that you can't see, like roads and bridges and buildings and kind of everything made by human hands, had this deeply psychological effect that for him was the terrifying and the sublime. So people have these really different reactions to seeing Earth from the cosmos, right? But illuminated by the sun, glowing in blue, shrouded in these white clouds. I mean, it really is magical, I think.
I like the words that you used: magical, terrifying, and sublime. Mm-hmm. So we'll leave it at those three. That's good. That's good.
Well, the sublime too, just really quick, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in philosophy, the sublime also refers to kind of the disappearance of the ego. So you stare into the maw of the abyss, and so sublime to me invokes this kind of thought that we could all be snuffed out, right? And that so Earth is even more dear because we're staring kind of apocalypse in the face, right?
Really?
So
what is it, the quote, when you look at the abyss, it stares back at you, or something like that?
Something like that.
Yeah, it's like, I messed that up, but we'll get it. We'll get it. So cool. Well, okay, so we talked about SETI, talked about the overview effect. Let's really quickly talk, because if we're seeing back, I guess you'd say, with the overview effect, something that I've been a part of and that you've kind of studied or researched, I guess, happenstance is like seeing ahead, and that's analog Mars simulation missions at MDRS. So I was a crew journalist for
oh, cool.
So for one of them.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So basically, so at the start of 2017, I started my year on Mars. For 2 weeks, I was inside of a module with 6 other people from around the world, an Indian, 2 French people, 3 Americans, and then an Italian. I think that's 7. Yeah, but
okay.
but yeah, so it was a great time. It was very interesting. But basically, the whole idea is that, look, we need to do very expensive and very possibly deadly, I guess you could say, things in space. And so we got to basically take down the time and take down the cost of all our experiments. And so why don't we do some of that stuff here on Earth? And so we go to southern Utah. We did a couple experiments of like ground sensing, some extremophile bacteria and stuff like that. So basically, let's just talk about analog simulation missions, because if the overview effect, like we're already up there, we look back at Earth, it's great, search for extraterrestrial life, we're looking, etc. But then MDRS is more of a technical kind of way to like try to get some of those futures, try to get some of those techno futures and more maybe align or bring forth that. And so just wanted to maybe talk a little bit about that. And then I guess I'll prime this last thing is, you mentioned the word resonance, so I want you to kind of go into that. Is these scientists, Messeri, I guess that's how you pronounce it, writes, suspend Earth in the unfamiliar as a way to imagine distant worlds. A moment in which planetary geologists uncover rocks in the Utah desert whose morphology they would have expected to find on Mars. The scientists experience what Messeri identifies as the effective practice of resonance. So I guess I experienced some resonance. I wasn't a scientist, but thinking about like how these distant worlds would work, but then also having to do it through the confines of being on Earth. It's an interesting kind of analog mission, but at the same time, it's fruitful, but it's not all encompassing. So I guess let's talk about some analog missions or whatever as research come through.
Yeah, sure. So Lisa Messeri went through my graduate program, and she's been an absolute mentor to me. And now she's an anthropologist at Yale. So what she's describing here, if I remember her work correctly, is that she's describing a situation in which the unfamiliar gets tethered to the familiar in this kind of inverted way. So if I'm remembering this, what we call an ethnographic moment correctly, she's witnessing scientists look at some kind of geological formation on Earth, having already imagined that specific formation off Earth.
Right. I think the idea was they kind of found a rock formation on Mars through some type of sense thing or satellite, and then they tried to find something that was similar on Mars.
And they get really excited. Yeah. So in this moment of recognition, right? It's not just that we, which is I think kind of getting back to this topic of the analog, which is that right we're not. It's this really kind of interesting scenario in which we're not transporting Earth, Earth's geology, earthly ways of being, earthly ways of operating to outer space and then performing them on Earth. It's that we're already anticipating the extraterrestrial here on Earth, which is and that's I think where she describes this phenomenon that she calls resonance. Yeah, I don't know too much about the Mars. I mean, you know way more than I do.
It was a great experience. But I mean, it was definitely, now that reading your work and if I went further on into your dissertation, I assumed that I would have more things to pick out of. But as soon as I saw that you had kind of seen some analog simulation missions, I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting.
Well, so let me just try to answer your question again. So analogs for me come in the dissertation. Analogy is a form of reasoning, right?
Yes,
it's different than metaphor. It's like different than simile. I'm forgetting how they all kind of relate to each other. But analog is it's like enough to something in order to kind of try to understand what that thing is. So for my research, it's not so much kind of creating a landscape or kind of an experience of living off Earth. analogs come in when the SETI scientists I work with try to imagine alien others and how alike enough they would be to humans.
Right. Okay.
So something that came up, or something that comes up in SETI quite often, is the idea of animal analogs. So
Sure. Okay.
how we relate to different non-human animals on Earth. How could we kind of extrapolate that to how ET might see us? So
Right.
if you kind of remember what we were talking about, the speed limit of light,
Mm-hmm.
any technosignature that we might intercept would be from, this is just like statistically speaking, like probability wise, scientists infer that it would likely be from an older ET. People like Jill people like Jill kind of assume that because ET would be older than we are now, they would have reached technological maturity eons ago, so
Right.
100,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, we have no idea. So let's say that they did that, they might have had to have overcome things like nuclear apocalypse, and then they would just have longer lifetimes. So we've had radio technology for like 70 years or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
ET would have had it, if they still have it, they would have had that technology for millennia longer than we have. Excuse me. So it's a lot of like different inferences, I would say. If ET is older, they would be maybe more technologically mature. If they're technologically mature, and they would have had to have overcome kind of some dangers that technology invites, they might have progressed morally alongside their kind of technological development. This is not necessarily what anybody knows. This is not even necessarily what I believe. It's what I'm kind of just summarizing.
It's like you said, like it's so we're inferring this, and then if that's that, then it's this, and then most likely.
I'm summarizing for you, what Jill has told me. So if you think about that, you start to think about ET as this aspirational figure who would be wiser and more peaceful than us. And let's say that they have technology that's beyond us. So that kind of sets up this analogical relationship. If humans are to aliens, like how should I do this? Aliens are to humans as many humans think that they are to animals on Earth. Does that make sense? So that's where the analogy comes in. I myself am very wary of kind of setting up hierarchies of being, right?
Sure.
But it's just something to think about in terms of technology and communication. How we interact with dogs, like how whales, have different modes of communicating across long distances. How social groups of bonobos interact, which is really different than how social groups of humans interact. Non-human animals on Earth can inspire ways to think about how we would like to be treated by a more technologically advanced alien.
Right.
So that's how analogy comes in.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I like that you just brought in some of the other dynamics, because then I think that's also something that you mention in your dissertation that we'll get to, that basically you theorize, like the analogical comparisons really only come down to three figures: prehistoric human relics, non-human animals, and godlike entities. So like it's very interesting that non-human like animals, we can already see different social hierarchies, different like ways of being, different things, but obviously it's not at our consciousness, if not, but there's still ways of organization, there's still ways of biology getting together. So I guess this would be a good time then, I guess, to go into the Drake equation and the Fermi paradox. So then we'll get it right into your dissertation after that. So the Drake equation, for anyone who doesn't know, basically was an equation sketched out on like a coffee. Hey, this is one of those times that you would want the coffee napkin.
Yeah.
Exactly. A bunch of scientists, I think Enrico Fermi was one of them, outside of Chicago, outside of the Fermi lab, that basically postulated about, through using inferences, what is the likelihood of a conscious alien civilization out there in the cosmos. And then once kind of that Drake equation. Sorry, I mixed them up. Francis Drake was the guy who did the equation. Yeah. And then Enrico Fermi.
Frank Drake.
Yeah. Oh, Frank Drake. Sorry. Now I'm mixing them up again. Frank Drake. And then Enrico Fermi famously quipped back, so where is everybody?
Yeah.
You know, it's because basically the idea that you were alluding to as well, if these older civilizations have been around for a long, long time, the universe is very vast, but the universe is also very old in real comparisons of that. So I guess, do you have a favorite? The paradox is that if alien civilizations should be out there, the math says that we should absolutely see them everywhere, and billboards and all this other stuff and a bunch of techno-signatures, then why don't we? And so there's a bunch of solutions, if you will, about what that is. My favorite, I think, comes from like Dan Carlin, a hardcore history guy. He basically thinks it's like a pass-fail grade. You know, it's like, that's what it is. Nuclear technology is the pass-fail grade of any thing, and just by the sheer nature of the pass-fail grade, not many people make it. You know, not many civilizations make it, and so that the ones that do have a very specific way about going about life, etc. So I don't know if you have a favorite solution, or if you want to riff on that a little bit, but
yeah, sure. The pass-fail thing reminds me of, you know, Chekhov.
Anton Chekhov, yes.
Yeah, like, you know, if a gun is introduced in the first act, it's gotta go off by act 3. And I hope that's not the case, right? That once we know about nuclear technology, that it's inevitable.
Yeah, and take out nuclear technology for whatever, mass communication or something like that. Yeah,
sure. So Frank Drake, right? And as you mentioned, it's not really an equation. There's no real solution, and
there's just a bunch of variables, right? That they kind of inference up and down. And
so the original one has 7 variables, and it's, you know, the rate of star formation, how many of those stars have planets, how many of those planets are Earth-like.
Yes. And then the scales, well, it goes down directly from scale.
Goes down. Right. So a lot of the variable, or a lot of the terms in the equations have really different answers, and I think the first couple of answers, when Frank penned the equation, we didn't really know that much about the rate of star formation, and now scientists have a much better understanding of how many, because now we know, right, from kind of the explosion of exoplanets detections, not the literal explosions of the exoplanets, that most stars in the galaxy have planets orbiting them. Yeah. And now the question is not merely if a lot of those planets are Earth-like, but which of those planets could host life, because scientists are discovering that there are all kinds of non-Earth-like planets that might host what astrobiologists like to call weird forms of life. So for instance, a tidally locked planet, which is, half of it is really cold and the other half is really hot because only one side of her faces its host star. Or you have these, Jupiter mass planets, or you have brown dwarfs, which could also host life. And so kind of how Drake was conceiving of how life had to follow kind of Earth's pattern. It has to be in the Goldilocks zone, and what's called the habitable zone, right? Not too hot, not too cold.
Yep.
It had to have the ingredients for what we think of as terrestrial biology. A lot of those assumptions have expanded, which is really exciting. Mm-hmm. But the term that I think, at least for SETI science, the term that like really kind of causes problems that we really can't know that much more about is the last term, which is the L term, the lifetime of the civilization. I keep using this word civilization, which we really kind of shouldn't use.
Yes. Yeah. I get you.
Right. So the
society.
Oh, yeah.
Or
society.
Do you even?
Yeah. Beings who like create technology, and how long their lifetime would be. So there's really only one example, which is us.
Yep.
And we don't know the lifetime of us being technology.
And that would be different than if we found life, say, on Mars in little cracks and crevices, or 4 feet down or something, versus a techno signature from a star, right?
Like, right. They don't use radio telescopes. Yeah.
They're not there yet.
Yeah.
No, that's great. And then another, I wanted to mention this because I did the other my favorite. It's not a good solution, if you will, but my other favorite is the dark forest theory. So, like Chik-Sun Lee, he did the three-body problem.
Oh, yeah.
The big, sci-fi thriller and stuff. And so the idea is the dark forest theory is that anytime a civilization or a alien kind of grouping gets to a level of consciousness, that they will then kind of invert into themselves. Because then, like you said, we've been just broadcasting radio signals out like for 100 years or however long. So that we're going to get noticed if other technologically advanced civilizations have that type of technology. And so that just is very interesting to think about, like how we see ourselves in the future moving on as kind of connected to how we see other aliens and stuff like that.
Sure, yeah, just like to clarify, so what SETI scientists call leakage, right? So just radio waves and television. Okay, I see. Okay. Yeah, that's like kind of an inadvertent inadvertent transmission, and SETI astronomers definitely are open to leakage, but my understanding is that a kind of a directed signal, a narrowband signal, something really powerful that was directed at Earth, that's going to drown out any kind of leakage.
So that we would get. Yeah. Oh, I see. I see.
It's impossible to kind of assume, like, maybe ET has a really sensitive technology that is that could pick up our leakage for sure. But SETI is very, very different than METI, which is messaging extraterrestrial intelligence, which is really it's not what they do at all.
Right.
Yeah. So the retreating into ourselves.
Basically it's like that as soon as they get knowledgeable, that they understand that they're leakaging out, that they say, okay, well, we're basically broadcasting our come find us signal,
right,
and we don't want that. So then now we're going to basically do everything to encrypt it or do a Dyson sphere around our star, so then you don't even see it,
right,
et cetera, et cetera.
Well, so and that's remind me, that's what happens in the first book, right? Is that they don't is that the Trisolarians don't know that Earth is there until they get that directed signal,
right. I honestly, it's been like 3 or 4 years now.
Yeah.
So now that you mentioned that actually might make, because then they had to send like something that was like the folding of space or something. I mean, they had some writing in there too. You know what I mean? So, but yeah, those were my other two things: the dark forest and then pass fail. So I don't know if
and
you have
there's one. Well, this just kind of reminds me of a paper that I think came out. There have been several papers. So again, kind of using the Drake equation as kind of a starting point to think about if and when and how we might get a technosignature, or if ET would know that we are here. This other theory, it's not my favorite theory because I hope that it's not true, but there's a model in which 3 astrophysicists, I think, kind of game out how life emerges in the universe and how life dies in the universe, and basically they postulate this homeostatic universe. So as technology, as life emerges, a technology using species would be at the end of their lifetime and die. So the answer to the Fermi paradox is that we have only been technologically we have only been fluent in the kinds of technologies that could perceive technosignatures for a really short period of time, and within that time, right, it's just a sliver of time.
Decades, right?
Yeah, and so and like I said, right, we're also bound by the speed limit of light, and so any kind of so that's another answer, is that as life emerges, societies die, and we exist in a really kind of narrow framework. This paper uses that to postulate that we'll find less complex life forms, so like microbes, before we find technology using societies later. So
yeah, because it's almost like the going theory now is almost like, or at least in pop science and stuff like that, is that we'll probably find things on Mars or a moon, but it'll probably be very small, microbes or something like that. But yeah, seeing a techno signature, that might be a different ballgame, though.
I hope so. Yeah.
Cool. Well, let's get into this last part. So, yeah, I mean, I hope that the previous stuff wasn't too dense for people, but this, put on your thinking caps. So,
Okay.
this is all you, Claire. I mean, first off, congrats on publishing a dissertation and graduating. Like, that's a huge endeavor.
I've tried to think about it not that much.
Not that much at all.
Yeah.
Because this happened also last fall, right? So it's still within the last year. Okay.
Yeah, and we just had our virtual celebration last Friday. I know it was so sad and dinky.
On
on
Zoom.
Yeah, the graduate program mailed me a keychain, and this MIT's mascot is a beaver.
So here's some swag.
Here's some swag, and my mom got me this. It's called a tam. It's what doctorates wear. It's
sure.
This funny little hat. So I wore that,
Amazing.
and it was 1 p.m. on the West Coast, and 4 p.m. So I had I think I had a LaCroix. I didn't even have champagne, it was
doing the most. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
So next year we'll do a celebration.
That's good. Mm-hmm. Well, so let's get into the weeds though. This is pretty packed with a punch of research, of quotes, of everything. I mean, this is 225 pages and 615 citations and footnotes. I mean, we talked about the citations and footnotes that
it should have been longer. I think I definitely should have had one more chapter.
Should have been. But so let's go high level and then kind of get into the weeds a little bit. So technologies of perception, searches for life and intelligence beyond Earth, is a history of and current work on scientific searches for extraterrestrial life. So this is obviously in your words. It is a historical and ethnographic dissertation whose theoretical orientations are informed by studies in science, technology, and society, as well as feminist traditions that examine sensory apprehension, especially those modes that enlist seeing and hearing. So again, we talked a little bit about how you picked the topic, a little bit, SETI, Ames research, etc. But putting this all together, I mean, is quite a feat. So we talked about SETI. Let's get into these modes, these enlisting, seeing and hearing. So you talk about modes of perception, basically. Can we just talk from a very high level about what kind of your dissertation is about, and then how the mechanisms that you talk about that we use?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So I think I was trying to sketch kind of modes of perception that I kind of theorized to be specific to the two kinds of searches for life beyond Earth. So if visual technologies of perception could be said to inform kind of searches for microbial life beyond Earth, or life in exoplanetary atmospheres, then listening is SETI's watchword. So the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, I theorize, is more in line with this mode of listening. So yeah, so we were talking about the overview effect and the technologies. It's called televisual technologies, or modes of perception like spectroscopy and even just photographic images from outer space that informed how scientists of the post-war era saw Earth from afar, and then that became literally the blueprint for kind of this searches for other planets that might also host life, or moons that might also host life. Listening in SETI, to me, is not a literal practice. It's this figurative practice for preparing yourself for someone else to speak to you. So listening is a mode of waiting. It's it's an active mode of waiting. And so in my dissertation, I describe how SETI scientists design the experimental conditions by which the alien will be made to speak.
Right.
So yeah,
we're already boxing the alien in without the alien even showing up yet already.
Well, I think
we're
that
categorizing them. How exactly are we doing it?
I kind of think it's the opposite. I think it's performing this kind of radical openness to how a technosignature would appear, that causes SETI scientists to do all kinds of different experiments, do all kinds of different data analysis, techniques to do things like all sky surveys, to do things like targeted searches that look at specific exoplanets, like from the Kepler catalog, to do kind of the galactic plane. So if you think about the Milky Way galaxy, we're on kind of this arm over here, and we point our telescopes to kind of the center. There's more of a probability that that stars, because there's more stars at the bulge at the disk. Yeah, that those stars will host planets. That from those planets there might be a technosignature. It's collecting data in particular ways. So in SETI science, I mean, now we're like really in the weeds. There's this trade-off between time and frequency. So I'm trying to remember what I wrote in the dissertation. The analogy, to get back to analogy, is you're sitting at an intersection, as we are in LA very often, and you take a high resolution photograph of a car, and from that photograph, a long exposure of like a few. Let's say you take a 3-second exposure.
Oh, okay, so it's like a moving image, or.
Well, yeah, okay.
You're taking exposure as in like letting it roll out, right?
Let's say you take a 5-second exposure and there's and the light is red, and you get all of this photographic detail about the make of the car, the color of the sky, and then let's say you take another series of photographs, but they're really short exposures, but they're taken 60 seconds apart. And from that image, let's say you're an alien visiting Earth, it's like, oh, the light changed from red to green.
Oh, so, I see, right? I see. Yes, yes.
Or this person is not a robot. This person is like drinking, what is that beverage that they're drinking? It's like a coffee, or like they're smoking out of the side of their car. So from one image, you get this like really rich, this really rich image, but it's totally compressed in time. You're frozen in time. From the set of kind of, let's say you take a photograph every 5 minutes and you see that this car isn't static. There are like multiple cars like coming to the intersection. Like, oh, like when the light is this color, all these cars stop on this side. So you get like more of a narrative story, but you lose all of the detail that you had before.
That's actually, real quickly, that's how the difference between like a photograph or like a long exposure and like a time lapse. Because a time lapse is like it takes a photo or a video at each time interval, but then there's a lot happening in between the time. And then another thing you could do is like just long exposure and you get the whole thing, but then you can't, it's less controllable. So that's an interesting trade-off that you said.
I should have let you explain this analogy, because I'm not a photographer or anything, but that's you have it exactly right. So you can imagine that analogously to how not just radio telescopes, but any kind of telescope that's collecting photons, you have to trade off time or frequency. And so, for instance, SETI scientists will sometimes choose the time domain, or they'll choose to privilege the frequency domain, or they'll kind of put them together, and you lose bits of both, but you gain something else. And this is a very, to get back to what I was trying to say, is that there are all these ways that SETI scientists try to anticipate how a technosignature will appear, how ET will have behaved. And those kinds of experimental design decisions are part of I'll just go ahead and use this word, epistemic, which is a word that refers to like how knowledge is made. They're epistemic conditions of what we call listening. So it's not Ellie Arroway, with the da-dum, da-dum, the heartbeat, zooming around kind of the array of telescopes. It's this waiting, it's this anticipation, it's creating the experimental conditions for the alien to speak.
Right. And then in that regard, in how we see that and how we, I guess you could say, make our framework is how we then see or perceive them as well. So that we are already, I guess bias is the easiest word. Like we're biasing our kind of framework, if you will.
I think so. And I think that the scientists that I work with would, totally agree. There's just, we can only perform experiments, at kind of the limits of our astrophysical knowledge.
And we're at the very beginning still. Like we're putting out the road in front of the track, or the track in front of the train. That's interesting.
There's this, so maybe it seems like you're a fan of sci-fi. There's
Absolutely.
I don't know if you read Ender's Game, but it's actually from, it's not original to Orson Scott Card, the author of that book. There's this, let me just say, there's this device in sci-fi literature which is called the Ansible, and it has different names, but basically it harnesses the power of quantum entanglement to do like instantaneous communication, and in that way defies kind of the strictures of the speed of light.
Right.
I think that E.T. might have developed some kind of Ansible, and they're just like, oh my God, you humans are so silly. Like, why are you waiting for us to like send you like a message that takes forever? Like, just build an Ansible, and then we can like get on the galactic internet together.
Just figure it out. Come on, get
come on. Yeah.
That's hilarious. Okay, well then I don't want to move too far gone, but you basically made I don't know if it's a new word or phrase, but reflexive alienation. Very interesting combo of words. Basically, in your own words, reflexive alienation is a reaching for an advanced version of ourselves, in Tarter's words. It is an act in which imagination of the alien object conjures human subjectivity. So I think that's kind of summarizing what we kind of just, like our bias kind of encodes in the framework of how we see or think about them. But then this last bit, this referential analogical dynamism, projecting and returning from human to ET to immortals and back again, is an enactment of reflexive alienation. So a mode of meaning making through attention to both a speculative ET and earthly desires for peace and a wondering of futuristic technology. So I think that's a lot of threads that we just kind of came around and cultivated, because not only is it our earthly desires for peace and wondering of futuristic technology that we talked about before, almost like not an ethical way, but more so that way.
I would say it's an ethics.
Okay, would that be, okay, so maybe that's an easier way to say it. And then both a speculative ET seeing us, like how that would work out. But really, I think the interesting thing for me when I saw that is projecting and returning from human to ET to immortals and back again. So it's almost like you have to go through this cycle to then get to the other side, but if you don't go through the cycle, then you didn't really learn anything. Is that, because it's basically like, you have to go through this whole thing about going the whole logic and everything to come back about how we really see ourselves. Otherwise, we're almost like hoodwinking ourselves into how we see ET, how they see us, how we think about future technologies, etc.
Sure. Yeah. So, I was pretty proud of that phrase. So
You're like, yes.
I'm glad you picked up on that. Yeah. So just to kind of break it down, so the reflexivity it's actually something that you do in anthropology a lot, and kind of the ethnographic working method is you try to understand yourself in relation to people who you're immersed with, and kind of the meaning.
I see.
The reflexiveness is kind of like is this mode of kind of self-analysis too, in relation to kind of your analysis of others, that you're asking yourself the same kinds of questions that you're asking of others to try to understand their culture. So it's this very kind of circular, meditative mode of kind of thinking through your work and your research. Alienation, of course, is this like, I meant it in several ways, which I hope is clear, right? So the alien is obviously, in that word, alienation also kind of refers to an intense and sometimes scary form of solitude or loneliness, right? When you're alienated from others.
Sure.
So reflexive alienation, kind of taken together as a phrase, is meant to refer to the kind of, because we are so far that we know of cosmically alienated, right? We cannot communicate with ET. That creates this kind of reflexive looping back that informs, right? It's the cosmic echo chamber. We don't have any object by which to kind of better search for life beyond Earth, and so we loop back and we loop back.
Because that's the only thing we have, really. We're looking around for some type of foundation, and that's really the only thing we have is ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But at the same time, exactly like you mentioned, seeing Earth as an alien might, trying to understand humans as aliens would, causes that's the inverse, right? So there's two starting points. There's from Earth trying to imagine alien others. Then there's trying to emplace ourselves in how ET would have behaved so as to better intercept a technosignature. So it's this kind of like double kind of looping back and forth.
Right.
The immortality that you mentioned does not refer to some kind of like mystical quality. It's the idea within SETI science that ET would have been to kind of take on God-like qualities, and the two qualities that I'm kind of thinking of, Avi Loeb at Harvard, it's not that he necessarily thinks that this is the case, but certainly considers it a possibility that life could be made in a lab, and so perhaps alien others could create life and then implant it on some planet, and then so in that sense they create life in the same way that in this biblical
it's like Prometheus,
sense.
It's like someone, they're seeding the life in themselves, right?
Sure,
yeah.
Sure. There's also, I think, what Jill Tarter says that ET might have been able to, and right, this is all speculation. This is not necessarily like their sole belief. It's it's just something that they think about and that I've talked about with them. Jill thinks that what we were talking about before, that technology and morality would have progressed together. ET could have perhaps overcome apocalypses that we're familiar with on Earth, and then become this long-lived alien society who their L would be basically infinite to the. So in that sense, they've achieved immortality simply by not dying.
Right, persisting.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
So this is not like this. It's not like a mystical thing. So when I use the word immortality, it's the creation of life, or kind of the pursuit of immortality, I guess. And so in those ways, ET again is this aspirational figure for futures that humans could possibly take. And so in thinking that ET might be that way, it inspires us to live long enough to find a technosignature or to develop technology to create life in the lab. So in that way, imagination of alien others sketches possible human futures.
That's interesting, because it's almost like that self-fulfilled prophecy comes about just by feedback loops, and then it's like, well, we're just going to keep with this feedback loop.
Sure. Yeah. Right.
We're just going to stay over here.
Sure.
So let's wrap up the dissertation, and in the sense is we just talked about godlike entities, about how we would see aliens and then non-human animals we talked about before, but we didn't talk about prehistoric human relics. So I don't know if you want to just maybe gloss over that quickly about what exactly that kind of thought process. Immediately for me, it's like prehistoric human relics. That seems like the figurine of the woman. It's like she has breasts or something. It's like something like that, like prehistoric kind of times. So then, but I don't know. You tell us.
Sure. Yeah, I can't remember what those figurines are called. She's really pregnant.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Or
and then she has
fertility.
Large breasts because it's about fertility.
Yeah,
yes,
she's
exactly.
like the ancient goddess of fertility, which of course has many forms, right?
Yep.
The prehistoric artifact is again this other analogy that SETI scientists use to kind of think about not just aliens themselves, but if aliens made artificial objects that would be coming from their past that we would perceive in our present, which is how we think about things like Stonehenge, right? It's obviously not created. It's not part of the natural landscape. Somebody dragged the blue stones from Wales. Yeah.
In this precarious position,
Yeah, that has and it has something to do with the solstice or the right. It was what do those objects do? They gesture at the concept of intentionality, that there was this artificial object created by intentional makers who put things together in a purposeful way.
I just started thinking cave painting as well, because if it was these megalithic structures, well then also
and like Lascaux,
Lascaux would be the thing. And then recently I think they've even said that specifically how it was drawn, like in the rocks, was specifically made for like firelight. You know what I mean? So like they would go around with a torch or something and walk around, and then like the play of the fire on that specific type of rock would then
created
make
this
it, like,
dynamism.
move.
Yeah,
And then it's like, whoa, wait a second. Then they were watching movies back in the day. You know what I mean? Like, what are we talking about? You know?
That's funny. Yeah, that's really funny. Yeah, exactly. So when you see a cave painting like that, you recognize it as something made by human hands for a purpose.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, that's what the search for, not the leakage that we were talking about.
Or the narrow banding.
The narrow band, intentionally sent signal that would maybe be directed exactly at Earth, right? That not only did someone go through the trouble of creating a technosignature, but perhaps knew that we were here and directed it at Earth.
Right.
So, yeah, that's kind of the prehistoric monument thing. The way that it's not just technosignatures as artifacts, but also physical structures. So there's things like a Dyson swarm or a Dyson sphere, or even that could be some kind of brain, right? This is like all speculation, you know. So a few years ago, I think in 2016, there was the strange dimming of the star that couldn't be explained by astrophysical models, and astronomers started to wonder, you know, is it like a highly dense cluster of comets? No. Is it this? Is it that? No. And I think that they ended up thinking that it was just oddly behaving dust that just like didn't like fit their models. But at the time, people started to, you know, after they checked off all of these boxes, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this, like, could it possibly be a Dyson swarm? And a Dyson swarm is called that because of the great astrophysicist Fermi Dyson, who had speculated, I think in the 1960s, that an alien megastructure would encircle a host star and funnel all of that energy back to kind of the host planet.
And this would be like Kardashev, or Kardashev 1, right?
Kardashev, civilization, or
2, because
I think.
Because basically you go from your planet to your star, then, right? That's the scales.
To the whole galaxy.
So that's
even
big
bigger.
Jump from that, but yeah, it's a Dyson swarm is like around your.
I know. I always forget the 1, 2, or 3. There's like a planetary.
I think we're like 0.7, right? Because I think it's like we're not even 1 yet. Like we're almost there.
Yeah. Right. Right.
But the Dyson sphere or Dyson swarm would be part of that like second layer, where we would basically be good enough at our planet, and we would be understanding technologically, or et cetera, to how to get energy from our star.
It's harvesting the whole energy of the host star.
Right.
So we harvest such a small percentage of our sun, even though it's this wonderful resource, like, talking again about climate change.
Oh, techno-futures? Yeah.
Yeah, right. Right, so in this, because the Dyson swarm would occlude the light from its host star, it would appear to us that the star was like dimming in this weird way.
Or something,
blinking,
Interesting.
So that's like kind of where the artifact comes in.
Well, but even that you mentioned about even how we see, like, I think it was Avi Loeb, right, from Harvard. He's the recent guy with like Oumuamua. Oumuamua, sorry, about, I mean, his kind of whole, I don't want to say thesis, but his whole idea is that was almost like cosmic junk. You know what I mean? Or like that was the junk from civilizations that were too smart or conscious, and then that's what we're seeing. And it's like, that's a very interesting thing, because then that also, like, how did you get to junk? You know what I mean? Like, how did you get to processing trash and stuff like that? Well, the only reason why is because we do that now. You know, it's like we only have one frame of reference. And then also the only, what's interesting as well with the Drake equation, that if we keep going farther and farther away and people get further and further away, then it's only more going to be reflexive, right? And how, the planets and galaxies are all going away from each other, going away. It's only going to become more reflexive back on ourselves if we can't actually talk, much less communicate or much less see any extraterrestrial life. So it seems like we're going to put a lot of our baggage into that.
Yeah.
So now we've talked so seriously about ET. Let's just have a little fun. What is your best, or maybe, I don't want to say best, but what is your most endearing, I guess you could say is a better word, sci-fi representation of ET? Like, is it going back to the old school, the little green men, or is it like the gray guy with the big eyes, or is it like some thing that we can't even think about? What's your kind of feeling about ET?
Sure. I think I'll indulge this because I think that the imaginations of ET ultimately say our own hopes or fears, right?
Back to that reflexivity.
Exactly. Yeah. So I love sci-fi, of course. I don't know. I mean, we talked about Ender's Game, and the aliens there. They're called the Formics, and they're bug-like, and and they have like this hive mentality. I don't know. There are probably many. I hope that there are many different kinds of aliens who, could flit through dimensions, who have figured out quantum entanglement.
Stuff.
Yeah, who have found ways to like tunnel through the universe using wormholes or tesseracts. Like, I think, really, I have no idea. Nobody has any idea. My hope for them is that they, I really don't know.
Do you have a favorite representation? Because like for us recently, we love like Arrival.
So that's funny you say that, because
Ted Chiang and his short stories and stuff are much more a utopic kind of vision rather than a typical dystopic sci-fi. And so that's just one that came to mind, and that's a different kind of take.
So what I really like about the aliens in Arrival is that movie is so good because it bends time and space, which is ultimately what SETI researchers are actually trying to do. They're trying to defy kind of the limits of space-time. If the timing isn't right. We were talking about, life emerging and aliens dying, kind of in this like homeostatic balance, and we're too young or too old to find them or communicate with them on either side. I like the aliens in Arrival because they found a way to bend time and space, and that's how I hope aliens would. Bending time and space for good sounds great to me. Yeah, sounds really good.
Claire Webb. Bending time for space and time for good.
Yeah,
all right, good.
That almost sounds like a 1950s like slogan here or something.
It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. So second to last question then. So you have kind of you've moved out here to LA. You're starting some fellowships, and then so you actually started a new project. I just found this on your website. It says, I'm beginning a new project situated in feminist posthumanism. The project asks, what are the computational processes scientists have used since the 1950s to configure software and hardware, assemblages that are shifting traditionally perceived thresholds of livingness, to find novel forms of life beyond Earth. So I guess now that you've kind of not moved on from SETI and stuff, because I'm assuming you probably have a close ear to the pavement with all this, but what's kind of next? What's up next for you?
Yeah, so that second project is very aspirational because I'm working on turning my dissertation into a book now. Okay. But the second project in feminist posthumanism is kind of I guess it's like an area of scholarship that seeks to understand how what we call the ontological character of the human is kind of being further destabilized by non-human entities like animals and computers. So, so honestly, since getting a dog, I've been thinking about animals a lot. And in this moment where AI is really shaping our world, I'm really interested in kind of the phenomenology, which just means kind of the experience of perception, how we perceive our world, how non-human ways of sensing and perceiving are brought to bear on kind of how we see ourselves as humans, how we're entangled with all kinds of non-human others, like, puppies or your gut microbes or or just these entities in the world that are making us realize more and more that we're not the center of the universe. And
bees, save the bees.
Save the bees, yeah, save the whales, save the bees. Yeah, so non-human modes of sensing and perceiving, including maybe a self-aware AI system. That's kind of my second project. What kind of started this is actually something that MIT Tech, the magazine, reported on. It's called the Animal AI Olympics, and it pits computer system avatars. Like if you imagine a video game and you're controlling like a mouse or something, doing logic tasks that are like you compete against kind of animals. So there's like some kind of, I think it's like an orangutan solving a logic puzzle to like get a piece of food. Can you build machine learning programs to like do that faster?
Oh yeah, sure.
So I just think that this idea of kind of humans, animals, and machines, how these three entities are being reworked together in this moment.
That's very interesting. I mean, because there's a lot of degrees of ways you can take it. For me, I'm already thinking about like anthropomorphizing, you know what I mean, and stuff, and how that comes, even reflexivity back, and how we even see what they are capable of doing just by what we are biased on. So
yeah, do robots need to look like humans? Right.
Exactly.
You know, if you like brain implants, how does that change? Like that, how does that form what we call cyborgs, like cyborgian mashups of humans and machines?
Sure.
So, and how so much of our lives now are informed by self-tracking data. How many steps did I take? Like, what is my oxygen level? Like, having a hearing aid. Those kinds of technological devices that kind of get mixed in with kind of the fleshiness of being a human. How are those phenomena reshaping what it means to be human? So that's kind of the area that posthumanism is, and I'm really interested in it.
And then, but it's also not just posthumanism; it has a feminist overlay on it, like specifically, as you say, like because we're past Me Too and all this stuff. Like it's a new world, if you will, and there's a lot of feminist and queer ideology and things like that are now coming into the mainstream, if you will. Yeah.
So I think queer is this capacious term that kind of just refers to any kind of mode or movement that subverts kind of like a dominant ideology. So like cyborgs, I would say, are like inherently queer, and I'm interested in feminist theories of the body, like how are cyborgian mashups reforming human bodies, especially what we think of as women's bodies. So like for instance, I mean, a good example of how feminist theory can apply to posthumanism and kind of thinking about AI is why is Siri gendered? Why is her voice gendered as female, right?
Or even mild-mannered. Like, why isn't she your like Italian grandmother like yelling at you?
Right.
You know what I mean? Or something, or like some kid who doesn't talk. Like, obviously, again, there's that range.
Yeah, and so as a feminist theorist, I'm interested in kind of analyzing technology from the perspective of kind of systems of gender, systems of race, systems of bias, like narratives about that. So yeah, that's awesome. That's my new project.
That's your new stuff?
That's my new stuff,
all right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, okay, so last question, and this is what I ask everyone. Basically, and this is kind of, to not exactly throw you off, but makes you kind of think, and we've touched on a lot of this, so don't freak out, or, it's basically, if you were kind of, say, up at the ISS, and they had a video feed, and you're experiencing the overview effect, but then that video feed is literally just going to everyone in the world. Do you have anything that you would say? Like, do you have, it doesn't have to be like what is it that Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, be kind, or, but it's like, is there one thing that you like just feel very called to? Is it the SETI stuff? Is it the postmodern? Or is it nothing? We've had people that said, well, I just, not really say anything. So I don't know if you experiencing the overview effect would be anything for you to talk of, but if not just that, then is there any words of wisdom or last things, parting stuff it's more for you to say?
Yeah, well, so you know that they read didn't they read like Genesis or something in the first overview? I would not do that. I'd probably read a poem by, I don't know, Sappho or Rilke. That's what I would do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll have to get that poem and put it in the show notes.
Sounds great. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Cool. Well, do you have any other things that you might want to talk about? Other things? If
no,
not,
go aliens. I mean, like please contact us if you're listening right now.
Yeah, right. More of the same.
Uh-huh.
Well, cool, Claire. Well, I guess that wraps us up. So thank you for coming on Eclectic Spacewalk Conversations.
Thank you for having me. It was really fun.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.